Imagine a man so charming, so persuasive, that he could walk into a royal court and convince kings, dukes, and financiers that he held the secret to endless wealth. A man who promised a new future for France, a future where paper itself could be turned into gold. For a while, the world believed him. People sold their homes, pawned their jewelry, and borrowed fortunes just to follow his vision. And for a fleeting moment, it worked. The dream became real. But dreams built on greed and illusion rarely last. And when they collapse, they leave behind not just broken banks, but broken nations. This is the story of John Law, gambler, genius, visionary, and ultimately the architect of one of the greatest financial bubbles in history, the Mississippi Company. Lesson 1. The Gambler Who Outsmarted Kings. John Law was not born into nobility. He wasn't a prince, a duke, or a wealthy heir. He was a Scotsman, born into a family of bankers with a brilliant mind for numbers and a dangerous love for risk. From a young age, Law discovered he had two gifts: the ability to calculate odds like no one else, and the charisma to make people believe in him. He became a gambler. Not the kind you see today in smoky casinos, but the kind who made fortunes in the elegant salons of Europe. Cards, dice, horses, it didn't matter. John Law played to win, and he almost always did. His reputation grew. Some called him a mathematical genius. Others whispered that he was simply lucky. But there was a darker side. In 1694, in London, Law's reckless charm got him into a duel. He killed his opponent. Sentenced to death, he escaped prison and fled the country. From that day, he was a fugitive, a man living by his wits across Europe. It was during these wandering years that John Law developed his most dangerous idea. He saw how economies struggled under the weight of metal coins. Gold and silver were scarce, trade was slow, and governments were drowning in debt. What if money didn't need to be metal at all? What if it could be paper, issued in abundance, backed by confidence, moving freely through the veins of commerce like blood through the body? To most, it sounded insane. But John Law was no ordinary dreamer. He was a gambler, and he was ready to place the biggest bet of his life.
Lesson 2. The Birth of Paper Money in France. When John Law arrived in France in the early 1700s, the kingdom was on the brink of financial ruin. King Louis XIV, the Sun King, had built his dazzling palaces and waged endless wars, but he left behind a mountain of debt. The country was broke. Gold and silver had fled the kingdom, trade was stagnant, and the treasury was desperate. Enter John Law. The charming Scotsman pitched his radical idea directly to the French regent, Philippe II, Duke of Orleans. What if France could replace heavy coins with lightweight paper? What if they could issue banknotes backed not by gold, but by land, trade, and the confidence of the people? The regent, desperate for a miracle, listened. Law was persuasive. He spoke not like a banker, but like a visionary. And in 1716, the impossible happened. John Law was granted permission to open a bank, the Banque Générale. It was a private bank, but soon it became the beating heart of the French economy. For the first time, the French could deposit their heavy metal coins and receive paper notes instead. These notes circulated quickly, fueling trade, stimulating business, and restoring hope. People loved it. The economy, starved for liquidity, suddenly bloomed. But John Law was not finished. He had another card up his sleeve, the Mississippi Company. This grand venture promised to exploit the riches of French Louisiana, that vast and mysterious territory across the Atlantic. Gold, silver, furs, land, the possibilities seemed endless. Law merged his bank with the company, creating a financial empire. The French public was swept into a frenzy. Everyone wanted shares. Farmers, nobles, merchants, even servants, they all crowded into Paris, desperate to buy a piece of this new fortune. Stocks soared, fortunes were made overnight. And John Law, the fugitive gambler from Scotland, was now the controller general of France's finances, the man who held the nation's future in his hands. But as every gambler knows, the higher the stakes, the greater the risk. And behind the dazzling promise of paper wealth, shadows were already forming.
Lesson 3. The Frenzy in Paris. By 1719, Paris had transformed into something never before seen in Europe. The narrow streets around Rue Quincampoix, a cramped, crooked little street, became the epicenter of madness. People from all walks of life gathered there, day and night. Aristocrats in powdered wigs, merchants with their ledgers, bakers and butchers, servants who had pawned their last possessions, all elbow to elbow, shoving and shouting, desperate to buy shares of John Law's Mississippi Company. The promise was irresistible. The papers and pamphlets claimed Louisiana was a paradise overflowing with riches, gold glittering in the rivers, fertile fields stretching endlessly, exotic goods ready to be harvested. The reality? Much of Louisiana was swamps, mosquitoes, and hardship. But few wanted to hear that truth. The stock price soared. What started at 500 livres per share shot up to 1,000, then 5,000, then 10,000. People mortgaged their homes, sold their land, even borrowed from strangers to get in on the action. Fortunes were created overnight. Maids became mistresses of wealth. Nobles, ruined by decades of war, suddenly found themselves rich again. The street itself turned into a theater of chaos. Coaches jammed the alleys. Brokers shouted until they lost their voices. Shops and taverns emptied as everyone from bakers to bishops rushed to trade. Paris was consumed by speculation. And John Law? He was celebrated like a prophet. Crowds followed him in the streets. The regent showered him with titles. He was no longer just the gambler who had fled Scotland. He was the savior of France, the man who had conjured wealth out of thin air. But beneath the frenzy, cracks began to form. Some whispered that Louisiana was not the El Dorado everyone believed. Others noticed that the paper notes were multiplying faster than real wealth. A few cautious voices warned, what goes up so quickly can crash just as fast. Yet in the fever of Rue Quincampoix, no one wanted to listen. The dream was too sweet, the profits too dazzling, and so the bubble swelled, higher and higher, waiting for the inevitable pin. Lesson 4. The Collapse. In early 1720, the shine began to fade. Whispers spread through Paris. Louisiana wasn't a golden paradise at all. Letters from settlers painted a grim picture: swampy land, unbearable heat, disease, and no sign of the promised mountains of gold. Still, the speculation machine kept grinding. Law tried to maintain confidence by printing more and more paper money, assuring everyone that France had entered a new age of wealth. But with every new note issued, suspicion grew. What if this fortune was built on nothing but air? And then the bubble popped. It started quietly. A few investors decided to cash out, trading their shares for real coin. Others followed. The company's stock price, once soaring at 10,000 livres, began to fall. 9,000, 8,000, 7,000. Panic spread through Rue Quincampoix like wildfire. The same crowds that once fought to buy shares now fought to sell them. The paper money law had issued flooded the market, but people no longer trusted it. Everyone wanted hard silver and gold. But France's vaults were nearly empty, drained by years of war and reckless spending. The scenes turned violent. Coaches overturned, mobs stormed brokers' offices, fights broke out in the street. Men who had been millionaires on paper just days before were suddenly bankrupt. Noble families were ruined. Ordinary citizens lost everything. John Law, once hailed as the savior of France, became its scapegoat. The crowds that once cheered him now cursed his name. Stones were thrown at his carriage. The regent, fearing for his own position, turned his back on the man he had trusted. By the end of 1720, the Mississippi bubble had burst completely. Fortunes vanished overnight. The dream of effortless wealth gave way to hunger, debt, and rage. And John Law? Disgraced and hated, he fled France in disguise, a broken man. He died years later in Venice, penniless, the gambler who had once held the wealth of a nation in his hands, undone by the same game of chance he thought he could master. The Mississippi bubble remains one of history's greatest warnings. Money built on illusions cannot last. Paper promises are no substitute for real wealth.
Lesson 5. The Aftermath and the Lesson for Us Today. When the smoke cleared in 1721, France was a different country. The Mississippi bubble had destroyed fortunes, broken trust in banks, and shaken the very idea of paper money. Thousands of families were ruined, while a lucky few who cashed out early became legends of wealth. The streets of Paris, once buzzing with excitement over Mississippi shares, were now filled with bitterness and rage. John Law was gone, but his shadow lingered. For decades, the French associated paper money with fraud and disaster. The experiment had been too extreme, too sudden, and though the world eventually embraced paper currency, in 1720 it was seen as a dangerous illusion. But here's the part that matters to us. The Mississippi bubble wasn't the last. It was the prototype. Every generation since has faced its own version of Law's scheme. The South Sea bubble in England, the dot-com crash, the housing collapse of 2008, even the crypto booms and busts of our own era. The same pattern repeats. 1. A dream is sold. This will change the world. 2. Prices rise. Everyone's getting rich. Don't miss out. 3. Doubt creeps in. Wait, is this real? 4. Collapse comes fast. It was all built on air. The Mississippi story shows us that bubbles aren't about numbers. They're about psychology. Greed, fear, envy, and the desperate hope of easy wealth. John Law didn't just invent paper money, he invented the modern financial hype cycle. So what's the lesson for us today? It's this: beware the promise of easy riches. If wealth comes too quickly, if everyone around you is chasing the same dream, if the air feels charged with euphoria, step back. Ask the question that Paris forgot to ask in 1720. What is this really worth? Because behind every bubble, there's always a law, a man selling a dream that cannot last. And behind every collapse, there are ordinary people left holding worthless paper. The Mississippi bubble isn't just history. It's a mirror.